A desperate father knocked on her door at midnight, clutching a starving newborn and begging for milk. What she did next broke every social rule you can imagine. But here's what nobody saw coming. The biological changes that happened to her body defied everything doctors thought they knew. The pounding started before sunrise. Not the gentle rap of a neighbor borrowing sugar, but the kind of desperate hammering that means life or death. Sarah wiped flour from her hands and hurried to the door of her small cabin, her boots echoing against the rough wooden planks. What she found would change everything. A man stood swaying on her porch, dust covering him head to toe like he'd ridden through a sandstorm. His clothes hung loose, his face was burnt red from the sun, and his chest heaved like he'd been running for miles. But none of that mattered compared to what he held in his arms. The bundle was so small, she almost missed it. Wrapped in a torn piece of fabric that might have once been a shirt, a tiny baby lay silent against the stranger's chest. The infant's lips looked dry, almost blue, and its little body seemed to barely move with each shallow breath. "Please," the man gasped, stumbling forward. "My baby needs milk." Sarah's heart sank. She knew what this meant, and it wasn't good. Milk was like gold out here in the middle of nowhere. Most families barely had enough food to keep themselves alive, let alone extra to share with strangers who showed up at dawn. The nearest town was a 2-day ride, and the closest neighbor lived miles away across dangerous terrain. Then there was the harsh reality everyone knew but rarely spoke about. Babies died out here, a lot of them. The numbers were brutal, especially during the long winters when food ran low and sickness spread like wildfire. Some frontier settlements lost more than 3 out of every 10 babies before their first birthday. Mothers would give birth knowing the odds were stacked against their children from the very first breath. When a baby lost its mother, those odds got even worse. Sarah had seen it happen before. A woman would die in childbirth, leaving behind a helpless infant and a father who had no idea what to do. There were no bottles you could buy at a store, no formula powder to mix with water. The fancy feeding contraptions they had back east were useless luxuries out here, where survival meant making do with what you had. Cow's milk seemed like the obvious solution, but it often made babies sicker. Something about it didn't agree with their tiny stomachs, causing them to waste away even faster. The locals called it milk sickness, though nobody really understood why it happened. Most of the time, motherless babies simply didn't make it through their first harsh winter on the frontier. "When did he last eat?" Sarah asked, though she was afraid of the answer. The man's voice cracked. 2 days, maybe 3. I've been riding from cabin to cabin, but nobody... He trailed off, his eyes filling with tears. He was too exhausted to hide. Sarah looked down at the baby again. The child was eerily quiet, which was actually a bad sign. Healthy babies cried when they were hungry. This little one was too weak even for that. His tiny fingers were wrinkled, his fontanelle looked sunken, and his skin had that papery texture that meant serious dehydration. Time was running out fast. The whole situation felt impossible. Even if she wanted to help, what could she realistically do? She didn't have a cow, and her own food supplies were carefully rationed to last through the next harsh season. One bad harvest or unexpected cold snap could mean the difference between survival and starvation for her own family. But looking at this desperate father holding his dying child, Sarah felt something stirring inside her chest. It was the same feeling that had made her and her husband pack up everything they owned and head west in the first place. The belief that sometimes you had to take risks to do what was right. The baby's breathing seemed even more shallow now, if that was possible. His father swayed on his feet, looking like he might collapse at any moment from exhaustion and grief. Well, Sarah thought, there was one option nobody had mentioned yet. It was risky, unconventional, and would probably cause tongues to wag all over the territory. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and the weird part is, what she was about to do might just save this baby's life, even if it meant risking her own reputation in the process. The choice she was considering would challenge everything their small frontier community believed about proper behavior and social boundaries. But first, she needed to hear the full story of how this father and child had ended up on her doorstep, fighting for survival in the unforgiving wilderness. The man's voice cracked as he spoke, desperation bleeding through every word. His wife had died just 3 days after giving birth, leaving him with a baby who hadn't eaten properly since. You could see it in the infant's face, that hollow, sunken look that meant trouble. Big trouble. Back then, there wasn't a corner store where you could grab baby formula. Hell, there wasn't even baby formula to grab. The stuff wouldn't be invented for another few decades. When a mother died, her baby faced a death sentence unless someone stepped in fast. And finding someone willing to step in? That was harder than finding water in a drought. Wet nurses existed in big cities like New York or San Francisco, but they cost serious money. Out here in the middle of nowhere, you'd have better luck finding a unicorn. Most frontier families were barely scraping by themselves. Asking a neighbor to feed your child meant asking them to risk their own family's survival. Then, there's the ugly truth about cow's milk. Sounds logical, right? Baby needs milk, cow makes milk, problem solved. Wrong, dead wrong. Feeding straight cow's milk to infants often killed them faster than starvation would. Something called milk sickness swept through settlements regularly, and babies were sitting ducks. The milk was too rich, too different from human milk. Their little bodies couldn't handle it. But what choice did desperate fathers have? Watch their children waste away or roll the dice with whatever milk they could find. Most chose the gamble. Most lost. The baby in this man's arms had already started showing the telltale signs. His skin looked loose and papery. His eyes had sunk back into his skull. When babies stop crying, that's when you really worry. Healthy babies make noise, lots of it. This little one barely had the energy to breathe. The rancher's hand shook as he held his son. 3 days without proper food had taken its toll on both of them. The father hadn't slept, hadn't eaten much either. Grief does that to people, combines with panic, and you get a walking ghost of a man. Neighbors rarely shared their limited food supplies with strangers, especially not something as precious as milk. Every frontier family lived by an unspoken rule. Take care of your own first. Had to. Resources were too scarce, winters too harsh, disasters too common. One bad harvest, one sick cow, one harsh winter could wipe out an entire family. Helping others was a luxury most couldn't afford. Yet here stood this woman, looking at a dying baby and a broken father. The smart move was obvious. Point them toward the next town, wish them luck, close the door, keep her family safe, protect what little she had. The mathematical reality was brutal. In some frontier settlements, more than 3 out of every 10 babies died before their first birthday. Motherless infants, their odds were worse than a poker player's against a marked deck. Everyone knew it. Everyone accepted it as the price of living on the edge of civilization. Disease spread fast in small communities. Taking in strangers meant risking your own family's health. One sick visitor could kill half a town within weeks. Smallpox, cholera, typhoid. They moved through settlements like wildfire through dry grass. Smart families kept their distance from outsiders. The woman stared at the baby's face. His breathing was shallow, irregular. His lips had started turning pale. Medical knowledge was limited back then, but mothers knew the signs. This child had maybe hours, not days. Well, maybe she wasn't the smartest woman on the frontier. Maybe she was about to make a decision that would change everything. Because as she looked at that dying baby, something shifted in her expression. The desperate father caught it too, a flicker of hope in her eyes that hadn't been there before. What happened next would test every social boundary her community had. It would risk her reputation, her family's safety, even her own health. But sometimes when you're face-to-face with death itself, rules start looking pretty small. The baby's father held his breath. His son's future hung in the balance, dependent on a stranger's choice. Everything that came next would hinge on whether this frontier woman would cross a line that most of her neighbors wouldn't dare approach. The baby felt lighter than a sack of flour in her weathered hands, too light. His tiny chest barely moved with each shallow breath, and his skin looked pale as morning mist. The father stood there, hat in hand, watching her every move like his world depended on it. Which honestly, it probably did. Most frontier women would have handed that child right back. Not her business, not her problem, but something about the way that little one lay so still made her stomach twist. She'd seen enough babies on the frontier to know when one was fighting for life. This one was losing. Without saying a word, she carried the infant to her rocking chair by the window. The father started to follow, then stopped. Smart man. He knew what she was thinking before she did. Here's where things get complicated. Breastfeeding another woman's child wasn't exactly common dinner conversation in those days. Sure, it happened, but people didn't talk about it openly. Wet nurses existed in big cities back east. But out here, you were lucky if your neighbor had enough milk for her own babies, let alone yours. The moral guardians of frontier society had plenty to say about such arrangements. Cross-nursing, they called it, and they treated it like it carried some kind of shame. Women who fed other children faced whispers behind their backs. Church ladies would purse their lips and shake their heads. Even other mothers sometimes turned cold shoulders to women who broke these unwritten rules. But here's what those judgmental folks didn't understand. Sometimes breaking rules meant saving lives. She positioned the baby carefully, supporting his tiny head with practiced ease. The little one latched on weakly at first, barely managing more than a few drops. His father held his breath from across the room, watching for any sign of improvement. Then, something beautiful happened. The baby's grip strengthened. His breathing steadied. Color started returning to those pale cheeks like sunrise breaking over the mountains. The risks were real, though. Cross-family nursing could spread diseases between households. Tuberculosis, smallpox, even common colds could pass from mother to child to another family. Women who chose to nurse other children literally put their own families at risk. The frontier already claimed enough lives without adding unnecessary dangers. Yet sometimes those risks seemed worth taking. Native American women in the area understood this better than most settlers. Their communities had supported nursing mothers for generations, sharing the responsibility when mothers died or couldn't produce enough milk. Some settler women had learned from these practices, though they rarely admitted it publicly. Well, this wasn't exactly something you announced at the Sunday church social. As the baby continued feeding, his transformation seemed almost miraculous. The father's eyes filled with tears, probably the first hopeful tears he'd shed since his wife died. The little one's movements became stronger, more purposeful. His tiny fists unclenched, and his breathing grew deeper and more regular. The woman felt something unexpected stirring in her chest. Maternal instincts don't ask permission before they kick in. This wasn't her child, but her body was responding like he was. Her heart was starting to claim him in ways she hadn't anticipated. The father noticed the change too. Not just in his son, but in the woman holding him. The way she adjusted the baby's position, hummed softly while he fed, and checked his color and breathing. These weren't the actions of someone just helping out temporarily. "Ma'am," he whispered, "I don't know how to thank you." She looked up at him, still cradling his son. "Don't thank me yet. This little one's got a long road ahead." But the worst seemed to be passing. The baby's survival instincts were kicking in, and with proper nourishment, his body was remembering how to fight. Makes sense, right? Babies are tougher than they look, but they need the right fuel to prove it. News of the baby's recovery would spread through town faster than wildfire. Frontier communities were small, and dramatic events like this became everyone's business, whether you wanted them to or not. Some folks would call her a saint, others would whisper about impropriety and question her judgment. The weird part is, she was just getting started, because saving a baby's life was only the beginning of this story. What happened next would test not just her compassion, but her commitment to seeing things through. The father was already making plans to return the next day, and the day after that. This arrangement was becoming something neither of them had expected when he first knocked on her door that morning. Life on the frontier wasn't a romantic adventure story. It was brutal math. You either grew your own food or you starved. Simple as that. Most families raised everything they ate right on their property. Corn, beans, maybe some squash if they were lucky. A cow or two if they could afford it. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Drought could wipe out an entire year's crops in weeks. Thieves could steal your livestock overnight. One bad season meant watching your children go hungry while you pretended everything was fine. Well, that's if the diseases didn't get them first. Smallpox swept through frontier towns like wildfire through dry grass. Milk sickness killed entire families when their cows ate the wrong plants. Cholera turned healthy adults into corpses in a matter of days. And babies? They dropped like flies. In some remote settlements, over 30% of children never saw their first birthday. 30%. Makes you wonder how anyone survived it all, right? The weird part is, one nursing mother could change everything for an entire community. She became the difference between life and death for motherless babies. No formula existed back then. That wouldn't come around for decades. Cow's milk often made infants sicker instead of stronger. So when a woman could nurse another child, she literally held the power of life in her hands. But this created something most history books ignore: secret networks of women helping each other survive. Native American women and settler women sometimes formed these hidden alliances. They shared knowledge about which plants helped with milk production, which remedies eased childbirth pain, and how to keep babies alive when everything seemed hopeless. These weren't friendship circles or social clubs. They were survival networks operating beneath the surface of frontier society. Let's not forget the men usually had no clue these networks existed. They were too busy arguing about land rights and fighting over cattle to notice their wives were quietly saving each other's children. The women understood something the men didn't. Cooperation meant survival, especially when it came to protecting the young. Then, there's the brutal reality of frontier food production that nobody wants to discuss. Families lived one disaster away from starvation. A broken plow meant no planting season. A sick horse meant no way to harvest crops. A harsh winter could kill all your chickens, leaving you without eggs for months. Every frontier family walked this tightrope between having enough and having nothing, and the children paid the highest price. Most frontier parents buried at least one child, sometimes more. They had large families partly because they expected some wouldn't make it. Sounds harsh? That was life. No pediatricians, no hospitals, no emergency rooms. When a baby got sick, parents prayed and hoped for the best. Often, that wasn't enough. But here's where things get interesting. The women who could nurse multiple children became almost mythical figures in their communities. People whispered about them, not always kindly. Some folks saw these women as saints saving innocent lives. Others viewed them as dangerous rule breakers who threatened social order. Makes sense, right? Frontier society ran on strict rules about family boundaries and social expectations. A woman nursing someone else's baby crossed those lines in ways that made people uncomfortable. The risk was real, too. Cross-nursing could spread diseases between families. If one child had an illness, sharing milk might pass it to others. Tuberculosis, influenza, even syphilis could transfer this way. So these women weren't just risking social scandal, they were literally risking their lives and their own children's health to help strangers. Yet they did it anyway. Why? Because they understood something about frontier survival that the rule makers didn't. Sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to keep humanity alive. Sometimes compassion mattered more than social approval. Sometimes saving a life was worth the risk of losing everything else. The woman in our story knew all this when she first held that dying baby. She understood the gossip that would follow, the dangers she faced, the ways her decision would ripple through her community. She knew other women had made similar choices and paid steep prices for their compassion. But she also knew something else. The tiny child would die without her help. And in that moment, nothing else mattered more than keeping one small life from slipping away. The daily visits were about to begin, and with them, a bond that would challenge everything her community believed about family, duty, and the price of survival. What started as a single act of mercy was becoming something much more complicated. Morning came earlier than usual for Martha. She'd wake before dawn listening for that familiar knock. The baby needed feeding every few hours, and his father, Samuel, had developed a routine as predictable as the sunrise. 3 knocks, pause, then 2 more. Their secret code in a town where secrets traveled faster than tumbleweeds. Samuel would arrive carrying nothing but worry and gratitude. His weathered hands would shake slightly as he passed the infant to Martha, and she'd notice how his eyes searched her face for any sign of hesitation. There wasn't any. The baby had become part of her daily rhythm, like milking cows or checking the chicken coop. Except this task felt different, more important. The little one was gaining weight. His previously hollow cheeks were filling out, and his cries had grown stronger. Samuel would sit quietly in Martha's kitchen, watching his son latch and feed, tears often streaming down his dust-covered face. "I don't know how to thank you," he'd whisper every single visit. Martha would just nod and rock gently, feeling something unexpected growing in her chest. But the town was talking. Oh, were they talking? Mrs. Henderson from the general store had apparently calculated exactly how many times Samuel's horse was tied outside Martha's cabin. The blacksmith's wife claimed she could hear a baby crying through Martha's windows at odd hours. Even the saloon girls were gossiping about the unusual arrangement happening on the outskirts of town. Some of the chatter was downright nasty. Frontier communities had strict ideas about proper behavior, especially regarding women. Cross-nursing might save lives, but it also raised eyebrows and wagging tongues. The fact that Martha was unmarried made things worse. Respectable married women might get away with such charity, but a single woman? That was scandalous territory. Then there were others who saw it differently. Old Doc Peterson, who delivered more babies than he could count, quietly supported what Martha was doing. He'd seen too many infants die from bad milk or starvation. "That woman's got more sense than half this town," he told anyone who'd listen. The preacher's wife, surprisingly, also defended Martha's actions, though she kept her opinions quieter than most. Samuel started staying longer during each visit. At first, he'd hand over the baby and pace nervously by the door, but gradually he began accepting Martha's offers of coffee. They'd sit in comfortable silence while the infant fed, sometimes talking about weather or cattle prices, never about his deceased wife. That wound was too fresh. The baby was thriving beyond anyone's expectations. His skin had regained a healthy color, and his tiny fists would grip Martha's finger with surprising strength. Samuel noticed these changes too, and something shifted in his visits. He stopped looking like a man preparing to lose another family member. Instead, he watched Martha with an expression she couldn't quite identify. Martha found herself thinking about the baby between visits. She'd catch herself humming lullabies while doing chores or setting aside the softest cloth scraps for his comfort. When he'd fall asleep in her arms, she'd hold him longer than necessary, memorizing the weight of him, the sweet smell of his hair. The attachment was mutual. The baby would calm instantly when Martha took him, as if recognizing her scent and warmth. Samuel noticed this too. "He knows you," he said one afternoon, wonder creeping into his voice. "Knows you're safe." Word spread beyond their small town. Travelers passing through would mention the woman who saved a motherless baby. Some stories were accurate, others wildly exaggerated. One version claimed Martha could nurse any infant regardless of circumstances. Another suggested she possessed some mystical maternal power. The truth was simpler and more profound than the rumors. Winter was approaching, and everyone knew what that meant. Harsh weather would make daily visits nearly impossible. Samuel would need to make decisions about his son's care that couldn't wait for spring. The temporary arrangement they'd created was about to face its biggest test. Local women began offering unsolicited advice. Some suggested Samuel find a wife quickly, preferably one who could nurse. Others recommended he take the baby to a larger town where wet nurses might be available. A few even hinted that giving up the child entirely might be his wisest choice. Martha listened to these conversations with growing anxiety. She'd grown accustomed to the baby's presence in her life, to Samuel's grateful visits, to feeling needed in ways she'd never experienced. The thought of their arrangement ending filled her with unexpected dread, but Samuel's health was becoming another concern entirely. The stress and grief were taking their toll, and Martha wasn't the only one who noticed. What would happen to this fragile new bond if circumstances forced an even more difficult choice? The whispers started small, like most gossip does in frontier towns, but when you've got nothing but dust storms and cattle diseases to talk about, a woman nursing another man's baby becomes front-page news. Well, if there had been newspapers, Martha's act of mercy split the town right down the middle. Half the women called her a saint, the other half, they had different words entirely. "Shameful," muttered Mrs. Henderson from behind her general store counter. "A decent woman keeps to her own family." Meanwhile, old Doc Peterson's wife practically declared Martha the second coming of Florence Nightingale. The funny thing about frontier justice is that it changes depending on who's talking. Same action, completely different verdict. Every morning when Jakob showed up with little Samuel, more eyes watched from behind lace curtains. The baby had gained weight. His cheeks were pink now instead of that terrifying gray color. But success only made the critics louder. "She's getting too attached," they whispered. "It ain't natural." Jakob felt the pressure too. Men at the saloon stopped talking when he walked in. Not the comfortable silence of respect, the awkward quiet that follows scandal. Some folks suggested he should move on to the next town, find a proper wet nurse, stop causing such a stir. But here's what those critics didn't understand. When someone saves your child's life, you don't just tip your hat and ride into the sunset. Jakob refused to leave. Every single day, he made that walk to Martha's cabin. Rain or shine, snow or scorching heat, his loyalty was absolute. The social pressure got intense, fast. Martha's closest friend, Sarah, stopped visiting. Church ladies excluded her from their weekly sewing circle. Even the preacher, Reverend Williams, felt obligated to address the situation. He cornered Martha after Sunday service with his most serious expression. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "I understand your Christian compassion, but society has boundaries for good reasons. People are starting to question your arrangement." Translation: stop rocking the boat. Martha listened politely. Then she asked a simple question that shut him up. "Reverend, what would Jesus do with a dying baby?" The poor man stammered something about proper channels and walked away red-faced. But the criticism wore on her. Humans are social creatures, even tough frontier women. Being ostracized hurts, especially when you're doing the right thing. Martha started questioning herself during those long, lonely evenings. Was she causing more harm than good? Then there's the matter of what this meant for little Samuel's future. Small towns have long memories. Would this boy grow up with whispered stories following him around? Would people always see him as that baby from that scandal? Jakob worried about the same thing. He'd lost his wife, and now he was watching his child savior get punished for her kindness. The guilt ate at him. Late at night, he'd pace his empty cabin, wondering if he should pack up and disappear. Maybe that would stop the gossip, give Martha her life back. Well, the situation reached a breaking point when someone painted shame on Martha's fence. Cowardly act done under cover of darkness, but it sent a clear message: conform or face consequences. The weird part is how divided the town became. It wasn't just mild disagreement. Families stopped speaking to each other over Martha's choice. The blacksmith's wife supported Martha. The blacksmith himself called it scandalous. Their dinner table conversations must have been interesting. Some women secretly envied Martha's courage. They'd seen babies die from lack of milk, but they'd never had the guts to break social rules. Others genuinely believed she was destroying the moral fabric of their community. Both sides felt absolutely certain they were right. Jakob reached his limit when he overheard two men discussing whether Martha was that kind of woman. He didn't throw the first punch, but he definitely threw the second. And third. The sheriff had to break up the fight, which only added more fuel to the gossip fire. Let's not forget the practical concerns either. Martha's reputation affected her business. Some ranchers stopped buying her eggs and vegetables. Money was tight enough on the frontier without losing customers over moral controversies. Young Samuel, oblivious to the drama swirling around him, continued thriving. He started smiling at Martha, reaching for her face with tiny fingers. The attachment she'd feared was happening anyway. Every day made it harder to imagine life without him. The tension couldn't last forever. Something had to give. But what none of them expected was how quickly everything would change when Jakob started showing the first signs of frontier fever. The man who'd walked miles daily to save his son was about to face his own mortality. The rancher who knocked on her door that desperate morning started coughing up blood 3 weeks later. At first, he tried to hide it. Men on the frontier didn't complain about weakness, not when their child's life depended on their strength. But frontier illnesses didn't care about pride or stubbornness. Consumption was eating him alive from the inside out. That's what they called tuberculosis back then, and it lived up to its name. The disease consumed everything: your lungs, your energy, your future. In those days, getting consumption was basically a death sentence written in slow motion. No antibiotics existed. No hospitals with modern treatments. Just time ticking away with every bloody cough. The woman noticed his decline during their daily visits. His face grew gaunt and pale. His hands shook when he held his son. The baby, now thriving and gaining weight thanks to her nursing, seemed healthier than his own father. Life has a cruel sense of irony sometimes, doesn't it? Then there's the brutal math of frontier survival. A sick man couldn't work his land, couldn't hunt for food, couldn't even gather firewood without collapsing from exhaustion. The rancher's small cabin grew cold and empty while he spent his remaining strength visiting the woman who kept his child alive. But here's where the story takes its most heartbreaking turn. The rancher knew he was dying, and he faced an impossible choice. He could try to find relatives back east, if any existed, if they'd even care about a frontier baby, if he lived long enough to make contact. Or he could trust the woman who'd already proven she'd risk everything for his child. Legal adoption barely existed in most frontier towns. No courts, no paperwork, no official processes. When families fell apart, communities handled things their own way. Sometimes that meant children got passed between neighbors like unwanted burdens. Other times, it meant genuine love stepped in where law couldn't reach. The rancher made his decision on a cold Tuesday morning. He arrived at her cabin carrying more than just his baby. He brought a small leather pouch containing everything he owned: a few gold coins, his wife's wedding ring, and a letter he'd written in shaky handwriting. "I ain't got long," he told her straight out. No sugarcoating, no dramatic speeches. Frontier people dealt with death like they dealt with everything else: direct and honest. This boy needs more than a dying man can give him. The woman felt her heart split in two directions. Part of her had been dreading this moment, knowing it was coming. The other part had been secretly hoping for it. She'd grown attached to that baby in ways that surprised even her. Every day of nursing him had created bonds stronger than blood. Well, here's something most people don't realize about frontier motherhood. Women often raise children who weren't biologically theirs. Death took parents regularly, and communities had to adapt or watch children starve. But this situation was different. This wasn't about community obligation. This was about a choice made from pure love. The rancher placed his son in her arms one last time as a visitor. When he handed over that leather pouch, everything changed. No judge or preacher needed to make it official. The transfer was complete the moment she accepted his belongings along with his child. And the weird part is how the community reacted. Remember all that gossip and judgment from before? Most of it disappeared overnight when people saw a dying man's gratitude. Even the harshest critics couldn't argue with a father's final wish. Suddenly, her controversial nursing arrangement looked like preparation for something much bigger. Let's not forget the practical challenges she now faced. Raising a child alone on the frontier meant doing everything herself: farming, hunting, protecting her property, and continuing to nurse a growing baby. Other women had managed it, but barely. The mortality rate for single mothers in remote areas was staggeringly high. The rancher died 6 days later. His final words were a whispered thank you that carried the weight of complete trust. He gambled his son's entire future on one woman's compassion, and somehow it felt like the safest bet he'd ever made. But accepting that baby permanently meant more than just adding another mouth to feed. It meant becoming a mother through circumstances most people couldn't imagine. No pregnancy, no gradual preparation, no husband to share the burden. Just instant, complete responsibility for another human being's survival. The woman looked down at the sleeping child in her arms and realized she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. This wasn't temporary help anymore. This wasn't neighborly charity. This was motherhood in its purest, most challenging form. What she didn't know yet was how profoundly this decision would transform not just her life, but her entire community's understanding of what family could mean. The father didn't recover. Within 3 days of falling ill, he passed away in his sleep, leaving behind only whispered gratitude and a baby who would never remember his birth parents. The woman found herself holding more than just an infant. She was holding a completely new life, both his and hers. Without lawyers, judges, or official papers, she became a mother the frontier way, by heart and by hand, as the old-timers called it. No courthouse stamp could make it more real than the sleepless nights, the tiny fingers wrapping around hers, and the responsibility that settled on her shoulders like a warm, heavy blanket. Out here, love mattered more than legal documents anyway. The baby thrived under her care. His cheeks filled out, his eyes grew bright, and his lungs developed an impressive ability to wake half the county at feeding time. Neighbors who had whispered behind closed doors began stopping by with hand-carved toys and tiny quilts. Funny how a healthy, happy child can change people's minds about what's proper and what's necessary. Then there's the matter of names. The father had called the boy Samuel, but she'd been whispering little Jake during those long feeding sessions. She decided Samuel Jacob would honor both his past and his future. Makes sense, right? The boy would carry pieces of everyone who'd loved him. But here's where frontier life gets interesting. Word of her story began spreading beyond their small settlement. Travelers carried tales of the woman who'd saved a dying baby with nothing but courage and her own body. Each telling made the story a little bigger, a little more dramatic. By the time it reached Denver, she'd apparently wrestled a bear while nursing triplets during a blizzard. The real story was remarkable enough. In an era when child mortality rates hit 30% in some frontier towns, she'd snatched a baby from death's doorstep and raised him as her own. No fanfare, no recognition, just pure maternal instinct overriding social conventions. Other women began seeking her advice. How do you feed a baby when the mother dies? What signs mean a child needs help? Her cabin became an unofficial stop for desperate families. She never advertised her services, but somehow everyone knew where to find the woman who'd choose compassion over comfort. Well, the preacher who'd warned about society's boundaries, he ate his words when his own daughter faced complications during childbirth. Guess who he came knocking on for help? The same woman he'd criticized months earlier. She helped without mentioning the irony, though her slight smile suggested she remembered every sanctimonious word. Samuel Jacob grew strong and curious, crawling into everything and treating the world like his personal adventure playground. He'd tug on her skirts, babble incomprehensible stories, and charm everyone he met with gap-toothed grins. The boy had no idea his survival had become local legend. Community acceptance came gradually, then suddenly. One day, she was the scandalous woman who'd overstepped boundaries. The next, she was simply Jake's mother. Frontier communities had a way of forgetting their judgments when faced with undeniable results. A healthy, happy child tends to silence critics pretty effectively. Her courage rippled outward in unexpected ways. Other women found strength to help neighbors in crisis, sharing food, caring for sick children, supporting each other through harsh winters. These acts of mutual aid became more common. She'd accidentally started a revolution of kindness. The weird part is how her story shaped frontier attitudes toward family. Blood relations mattered less than daily care. Love meant showing up every morning, not sharing genetic material. In a place where survival depended on community support, chosen families often proved stronger than biological ones. Local newspapers eventually picked up her story, though they got most details spectacularly wrong. One account claimed she'd adopted 7 orphans and started a frontier orphanage. Another suggested she possessed mystical healing powers. The truth was simpler and more powerful. She'd seen a need and filled it. Consequences be damned. Samuel Jacob's first birthday became an unofficial town celebration. Neighbors brought food, gifts, and stories of their own acts of frontier kindness. The boy who'd arrived dying in a stranger's arms was now the center of a community that had learned compassion through his mother's example. She'd proven that maternal love could transcend biology, social rules, and community pressure. Her willingness to risk everything for a stranger's child had created something beautiful, a family built on choice rather than chance, and a community that valued heart over convention. But becoming mother was just the beginning of her frontier legend. The ripple effects of her choice would soon reach far beyond their small settlement, inspiring changes that nobody could have predicted.